Hey there. Today I'd like to invite you to go on a little journey around the world with me, together with Charles Darwin on the second voyage of the HMS Beagle. It was Darwin's big trip around the world, which lasted 5 years. It was originally planned for 2, but took a little longer. And he was only 22 at the time when they set off. And everything that he encountered on his journey, all the different species that he saw and catalogued, really informed his thinking and his later theories. So here we have a map of the world, and we're going to follow the journey down here in South America to the Galapagos Islands, and then back towards Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, round Cape Town and back up to England eventually. So the text in this book is based on Darwin's notes. He wrote a journal at the time that was published numerous times on the different editions. This year is the edition of 1890 that we see. It's called Journal of Researches into the Natural History and Geology of the countries visited during the voyage around the world of HMS Beagle, under the command of Captain Fitzroy of the Royal Navy. And here you see it says, by Charles Darwin, author of Origin of Species. So this is quite a late edition, where sort of his big book had already been published. So this is a portrait of Darwin from 1840, when he was 31. But like I said, when the Beagle set off, he was only 22. And the captain, Robert Fitzroy, was only 26. So they were really quite young. So the aim of the HMS Beagle was to do a survey of the shoreline of South America. There were some gaps in the maps, and not everything was quite clear, like the longitude of re-edition they wrote. So what they were doing was a hydrographic survey, anything to do with maritime cartography. So the issue of shorelines, tides, currents, the seabed. And Darwin wrote the object of the expedition was to complete the survey of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, commenced under Captain King in 1826 to 1830, to survey the shores of Chile, Peru, and of some islands in the Pacific, and to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements around the world. Normally, it was the ship's surgeon, who was also a botanist, who went on shore and collected different specimens of birds or insects. But in this case, Captain Fitzroy wanted to have an actual naturalist on board. And a number of different naturalists declined, so Darwin got the job. And he was very busy during the time. He collected 1,300 pages of notes on geology, 370 on zoology, and a catalogue of more than 1,500 collected species, plus almost 4,000 other specimens. So, that's quite impressive. Now, let's see how the journey went. So, the journey began here in the south of England in December 1831. In fact, the departure was scheduled for September, but it had taken them 4 months to actually leave the port. They then went down here, and they wanted to have the first stop at the Canary Islands. But because there was a cholera outbreak in England at the time, they weren't allowed to go on shore without a quarantine of 12 days. And I guess Captain Fitzroy was a bit impatient, so he decided to skip the Canary Islands and continue to Cape Verde. And there, Darwin went on shore for the first time and saw his first tropical jungle. So it probably looked something like this, the landscape there. And one of the things he noted was that there were compressed seashells in the cliffs high above sea level. So that was the first hint that there was probably some kind of geological change, that the ground had maybe risen up above the sea level and hadn't been created that way. From there they continued to St. Paul's Rock, and then they reached South America, here in Bahia, in March 1832. That's where the Beagle surveyed the coast, and Darwin had the opportunity to go on land. And he was quite busy while he was on land. He created a box of samples. He collected different insects. All these different types of insects. Small ones and larger ones, and this little giant. And here we see all the different kinds of shells that he collected. All these different kinds of shapes and colors. So he went through the world, really observing his surroundings. And paying great attention to details. So he could catalogue all these different species. And here are another two samples. These are in the Natural History Museum in London today. And you can see here on this old glass container, it says C. Darwin. I don't know if these are original. You can see the date here is given as 1946. So they might have been transferred at some time, or this is just a different strip of paper that was added when they were being catalogued in the archives of the museum. Both options are possible. Alright, let's continue. So from Bahia, the Beagle continued to Rio de Janeiro in April 1832, then to Montevideo in July 1832. And you can see it stayed quite close to the shore and eventually went down south to Tierra del Fuego. Let's see, here in December 1832 with a short trip to the Falkland Islands in the same month. So it took about a year to survey this coastline. And as you can see, they still weren't done. They continued back up north in 1833 and then went down again along the Patagonian shoreline. So while the Beagle was doing the survey work, Darwin had lots of options to go on shore and do his research. He only spent 18 months at sea on a 5-year journey, which I think is quite impressive. Alright, so now we're down here, Tierra del Fuego. Now this is quite interesting because in fact there were also 3 native people from this area here on the Beagle. They'd been taken hostage a couple of years earlier and had been brought to England. And now they came back to their homeland. And the idea was that they would work as missionaries. There are some portraits here in this book. This is one of them. He was called Jimmy Button. And that was the name that was given to him in England. He's wearing these typical English clothes here. And there's another drawing of the people who were native to Tierra del Fuego. At the time, in these notes, they simply spoke of Fuegians. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. But in fact, there were several different peoples living there who all spoke distinct languages that were not related to each other. Today, most of those are extinct, but the people that the Beagle had contact with, that these three natives with Jimmy Button were from, they were probably from a people called Yagan. I hope that's how you pronounce it. And they still live in Chile today. In 2002, in the census, there were about 1,700 people. So the language is also still spoken, but of course, with such a small population, it's a rather endangered language. So these three people returned home, and from what I know, they did not work as missionaries. I think Jimmy Button got married and I hope lived quite happily with his wife the way that his people lived. So from here, like I said, there was a short trip back north to Montevideo, then back south, and eventually in 1834 the Beagle went around the Strait of Magellan, I think. I don't think they went around Cape Horn, but through the Straits of Magellan here. It's a strait that separates Patagonia from the Tierra del Fuego. Let's see if we can find an image of it. It's quite a difficult terrain to navigate. So while the captain was preparing for it, Darwin went back on land and collected another 80 species of birds. Right, so this is from 1611. You can see here America. And up here, Tierra del Fuego, or Fuego it says here. So, south would be up here, and north down here. You can see it's indicated with this fleur-de-lis. I just realized I haven't shown you any drawings of the Beagle. So, there it is. This ship that managed 5 years at sea around the entire world. Of course, they were dependent on favorable winds, which was one of the reasons they left England so late. Because at one point the wind simply carried them back into harbour. But they successfully managed the Straits of Magellan, and in 1834 started the journey back north. Then took a little detour back south. Here, November 1834, before, let's see, when did they continue? Here, very closely to the shore. February 1835, March 1835. Then up here, the last stop, July 1835 in Lima, where in fact they were confined to the port because of political unrest, so they couldn't go on land. And then starts maybe the most famous leg of the journey, the trip to the famous Galapagos Islands, which the Beagle reached in September 1835. Alright. So the Galapagos Islands are a number of islands. Let's see what they are. We have some famous tortoises. Let's see if we can find them. Some of the famous finches that Darwin described. Okay, here we are. So on the left hand side we have a picture taken from the International Space Station. And on the right hand side we have a drawn map. And you can see these are a number of islands, some quite close together, these small ones in between, some a little more distant. Now, what was so interesting about these islands is that why they looked like, for example, these finches were all different kinds. They actually mixed in flocks as if they were one type. And you can see here that their beaks are quite different. So they were specialized on the islands that they lived on and the types of seeds that they needed for survival. And Darwin collected quite a lot of the skulls of these finches and catalogued them. You can see here, these are today at the University of California at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And you can see that the shapes are quite different, especially the beaks. And the same is true for the tortoises that live on these islands. When they arrived, somebody told Darwin that he could differentiate between the tortoises and know exactly which island they were from just by looking at them. And initially, Darwin didn't pay too much attention. But later, of course, that became quite an important remark. So here's one of these little tortoises. On the Isabella Island. So these observations were very, very important to his later work. But at the time they were just observations and notes in his book. It would take quite a while before he would publish them. In fact, it would take a while before he would be back home. So when they left the Galapagos Islands across the Pacific Ocean, they reached Tahiti in November 1835. Then continued to New Zealand, which they reached in December. They continued to Sydney, which they reached in January 1836. Then Tasmania in February 1836 and King George's Sound in March. Darwin spent some time on land in Australia too, but you can tell they didn't stay too long. A month later they were at the Keeling Islands, and in the same month, both in April, reached Mauritius. Crossed the Indian Ocean towards Cape Town, and then started the journey north to St. Helena in July. Ascension also in July. Then we go back to Bahia in Brazil in August. And from there, Cape Verde Islands, up to the Azores, and finally they reached England in October 1836. So it took them 5 years when initially they had planned for 2. And apparently Darwin then quickly went to see his family at home. But he arrived quite late, so he just snuck into his room and then simply turned up at the breakfast table in the morning. I think his family was a little shocked, but also quite happy to see him. Once he was back home, he started to work on his many, many notes. He published a number of different papers on coral reefs, volcanic islands. He wrote up his notes about the journey on the HMS Beagle. He wrote 4 different volumes on barnacles. But all of this in-depth work helped him to develop his theory on the origin of species, which he published in 1859. The book was called On the Origin of Species, or the Preservation of Favored Races and the Struggle for Life. Unfortunately, he fell ill when he was back in England. So he moved out of London to Kent. He married his wife Emma. They had a number of children, and I think they lived there for quite a long time. In Down, Kent. worked on his papers and his publications. Here we can see his study. All of these notebooks here neatly lined up. I really like the look of that. The books up here in the shelf. Plenty of notes here in this little cabinet. There's another one here in the background with some papers on top of it, maybe some maps. You can see there are more books and papers here. I guess he was quite a busy man. I get the impression that he enjoyed the topic that he was working on. And in the last 10 years of his life, you could say he retired. He started to work in his garden, where he observed the different plants, the climbing plants that you can see up here on the house, where he observed the earthworms in the ground. So he did what he liked best, observing nature. And I think that's quite a lovely end to the story. So, let's have a last look at this map. At this long, long journey around the sea, all the way around South America, up and down, just to make sure they caught every little bit on the map, with plenty of time to observe the different kinds of animals and plants, and the geology of all of these islands and continents. And then back home. So, let's close this up. I hope you enjoyed this little trip around the world with Charles Darwin. I think it's a really, really fascinating story. So, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.